She stood alone in court, a maid accused of stealing a millionaire's prized jewel. No lawyer, no voice. No one believed her. Until a quiet single dad in a worn military jacket stood up from the gallery. What no one knew, he wasn't just a janitor. He was a hidden legal genius, and he was about to turn the courtroom upside down. The echo of polished heels struck the courthouse floor like a slow drumbeat of judgment. Reporters pressed against the glass doors, their cameras' ready voices sharpening with each passing second. Inside courtroom 2B, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above rows of wooden pews filled with murmuring onlookers. Every seat was taken, and at the center of it, all standing entirely alone, was Kendra Blake. Dressed in her navy blue maid's uniform with a pressed white collar, her hands trembled as she clutched a thin folder to her chest. Her face, pale and unreadable, held the kind of composure that could only be described as silent defiance. A thin line of sweat glistened beneath her jaw, but her eyes were dry, wide, watching. The bailiff's voice cut through the room. "All rise. Superior Court of Los Angeles is now in session. The Honorable Judge Harvey Daniels presiding." Everyone stood. Kendra rose slowly, almost reluctantly, as if her legs belonged to someone else. When the judge entered and sat, the courtroom followed in perfect mechanical rhythm. "Be seated." Kendra sat still, alone at the defense table. Across the aisle, the prosecution team was anything but alone. 3 lawyers in tailored suits sat flanking Bernard Kingsley, the silver-haired real estate tycoon known for his sprawling Beverly Hills estate and legacy of old money. His cufflinks alone looked like they could pay off someone's mortgage. His expression was calm, smug, even like a man already confident in the outcome. A large screen behind him displayed a photo of the missing item, the Kingsley sapphire, a dazzling deep blue gem the size of a robin's egg, once gifted to his family by a European duke in the 1800s. This case, the lead prosecutor began rising smoothly, is not simply about a stolen gem. It's about betrayal, about trust shattered by someone hired to be part of the family. Miss Kendra Blake was not just a maid, she was a caregiver to Mr. Kingsley's grandson. She had keys to the entire estate and access to its most private rooms. Gasps fluttered through the audience. Kendra's hands clenched tighter around her folder. "We will present evidence that this woman," he pointed without hesitation, took advantage of that trust, waited until the surveillance system was accidentally disabled, and disappeared the family's most precious heirloom. Judge Daniels glanced toward the defense table. "Miss Blake, are you still representing yourself?" Kendra stood, her voice barely a whisper, but unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor. I have no counsel." He studied her for a moment, her uniform, her posture, the way her fingers kept folding and unfolding against the folder, like someone holding onto a ledge. "Very well. Proceed." Across the room, Bernard's gaze narrowed. He leaned back, smug. His lead attorney, a sleek man in his 40s, named Carter Doyle, stood with a theatrical sigh and began presenting timelines, diagrams of the Kingsley estate photos of the vault room where the sapphire was kept, only one entry point, one access panel, and Kendra's digital login as the only one registered within the time window of the alleged theft. She was the only staff member in the West Wing that night, Doyle emphasized. And curiously, the surveillance feed for that wing was inexplicably offline from 9:14 p.m. to 9:48 p.m., the precise time frame when the gem vanished. The evidence felt damning. The audience leaned in. A woman in the second row whispered something that made the man beside her shake his head. Kendra said nothing. Her heart pounded, but she refused to look away from the screen. From Bernard, from the boy she once cradled in her arms when he had fevers, the boy who called her Auntie Ken. He wasn't here today. He had always sat beside Margaret, the grandmother, in the gallery, but not today. Only Bernard and his lawyers. Something wasn't right. The prosecution rested its preliminary remarks with the flourish of a confident man who had already booked his dinner reservation to celebrate. Judge Daniels nodded. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning for witness testimony." Court adjourned. The gavel struck once. As people stood and filed out, cameras outside began flashing. Reporters pressed in at the doors like vultures sensing blood. Murmurs of gold-digging Maid inside job and open and shut case filled the air. Kendra turned slowly, her breath tight in her lungs. And in the very last row of the gallery, tucked into the shadows, sat a man she had never seen before. Dylan Brooks. He wore a faded green military jacket collar worn smooth. His hands were calloused, folded quietly on his lap. But it was his eyes, sharp, steady, watching with an intensity that unnerved her. Not judgmental, not pitying, but focused. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. He nodded once. Then he stood and left the courtroom without a word. The courtroom emptied, like the tide pulling away from shore. But Dylan Brooks didn't leave immediately. Not really. He walked slowly through the courthouse corridor, his boots dull against the marble floor, until he reached a long wooden bench beside the vending machines. He sat down not to rest, but to think. He pulled from his pocket a folded slip of paper, a printed docket from that morning. State of California vs. Kendra Blake. Theft in the first degree. Felony charges. Bail denied. No attorney of record. No defense, Dylan murmured to himself. He'd seen this kind of railroading before, not in civilian courts, but in military trials overseas, where pressure was currency and silence was mistaken for guilt. And he'd learned long ago that the most dangerous thing in any courtroom was a defendant who didn't know her rights. He unfolded a second paper, notes he had scratched in the margins with a golf pencil borrowed from the clerk's desk. Surveillance gap. 34 chain of custody. No police report until 48 HRs after incident. Internal investigation. Red flag. He underlined that last point twice. Later that night, Dylan stood in the dim light of his modest kitchen, drying a chipped mug with a towel. The cabin was quiet, save for the soft rustle of wind pushing against the pine trees outside. It was a simple place. 2 bedrooms, old wood stove paint peeling at the corners, but it was safe. His 9-year-old daughter Bella sat at the table working on a jigsaw puzzle, tongue pressed slightly between her lips in concentration. "Dad?" she asked without looking up. You're doing that thing again. The one where your eyes go somewhere else." Dylan chuckled softly, folding the towel. "Just thinking bells. About that lady in court." He paused. Bella always noticed more than she let on. Yeah, he admitted. About her. She looked really sad, Bella said. But not scared. You know, Dylan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Bella shrugged, fitting 2 blue pieces together. Like, her heart was broken, not because she was in trouble, but because someone she cared about didn't believe her. Dylan said nothing for a long moment. Then he walked over and kissed the top of her head. The next morning, Dylan returned to the courthouse early. He wasn't on any docket. No one expected him. That was how he liked it. He moved quietly, sat in the back again this time with a clearer view of everyone. He watched as Bernard Kingsley strutted into the courtroom like a man arriving at his own country club. Expensive cologne, impeccable tie knot. He shook hands with a journalist at the door, whispered something that made her laugh, then took his seat with the same confidence as a man ordering a steak at Delmonico's. Kendra, in contrast, entered quietly. Shoulders drawn and eyes downcast. She looked like she hadn't slept. Her uniform was freshly pressed, but her posture betrayed exhaustion. She sat alone again. The prosecutor presented digital time logs, screenshots, entry data, all showing that Kendra had swiped into the west wing of the estate at 9:16 p.m. and exited at 9:47 p.m., just 2 minutes before the gem's absence was discovered during a routine security check. Miss Blake, the prosecutor said, gesturing to the screen. Can you explain why you were in the secured wing during those minutes, despite protocol stating no cleaning or caregiving duties were scheduled after 9 p.m.? Kendra stood, her voice soft but steady. Ken, Mr. Kingsley's grandson, had trouble sleeping. He asked for warm milk. I took it to him. And yet, you made no mention of this during the initial inquiry by house security. They didn't ask me, she said. They only asked when I entered. Not why. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Dylan leaned forward slightly. The prosecutor continued. Isn't it true, Miss Blake, that you had recently been given notice of termination effective the following week? Kendra hesitated. I had been told my contract might not be renewed. So, motive, the prosecutor said, turning to the jury. Financial motive. Dylan's jaw tensed. That word again. Motive. Always used too soon. Thrown into the wind like a net, hoping it would catch something. But Dylan knew better. In court, motive is nothing without opportunity, and opportunity is nothing without proper chain of custody. And so far, no police report, no crime scene log, no search warrant, just internal findings from a billionaire's private estate. He took another note on the back of the docket. Where's the warrant? LAPD report missing. Private estate, Warkwaha, no oversight. When the session ended for recess, Dylan waited until the room cleared. He walked slowly down the aisle, passing empty benches, until he reached the front, where Kendra still sat alone. She looked up, startled. She had seen him before. He nodded once. Don't plead guilty, he said, voice low and steady. Kendra blinked. I wasn't going to, good Dylan replied. Because I think you're telling the truth. Why would you think that she asked? Because I've seen guilty people try to hide behind lawyers, Dylan said. You're not hiding. You're surviving. That's different. Kendra swallowed. Are you a lawyer? Dylan hesitated. Not anymore. Then he turned and walked away before she could ask anything more. But that night in his study under the glow of a desk lamp, Dylan pulled a box from the back of the closet. Inside, an old ID card. Brooks Dylan M. Captain, U.S. Navy Judge Advocate General Corps. He placed it on the desk, slowly, quietly. Then he opened his laptop and began reviewing California Penal Code, Paragraph 484, Paragraph 487, and People v. Marshall, a 1998 precedent on internal investigations and inadmissible evidence. He wasn't ready to step back into the courtroom, but maybe for her, he didn't have a choice. The morning began with silence. Not the kind that comforts, but the kind that presses on your lungs like weight, dense waiting watching. Kendra Blake stood once more before the court. Her maid's uniform was clean, pressed to perfection, but even the best stitched seams couldn't hide the wear in her shoulders. Her hands clutched the edge of the defendant's table so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. There was still no lawyer beside her. Still, no one in her corner. Across the aisle, Bernard Kingsley sat with his legal team, an image of curated wealth. His arms folded, legs crossed, his expression cool, impervious. One of his lawyers whispered something into his ear, and he smirked in response. The clerk called the session to order, and Judge Daniels adjusted his glasses. Miss Blake, he said, his voice calm but direct. Are you still representing yourself? Kendra stood smoothing the front of her skirt. She nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Daniels paused. I must advise you again, this is a felony case. If convicted, you could face significant prison time. A public defender remains available. Kendra hesitated. Her lips parted, but no sound came. And then softly, barely more than a breath, she replied, I understand. The prosecution wasted no time. The house manager of the Kingsley estate, a stern man named Mr. Greaves, was called to the stand. He recited facts with robotic precision, where the gem was stored, who had accessed the rotation of staff that night. Miss Blake's keycard logged entry into the vault corridor at 9:16 p.m., Greaves confirmed, and exited at 9:47 p.m. That was the only access recorded in that time frame. Was anyone else scheduled to be in that wing? Asked Carter Doyle Bernard's lead counsel. No. And what did you discover when you entered the vault the next morning? The sapphire was gone. Doyle turned dramatically toward the jury. So to be clear, only one person entered the vault wing during the time the gem disappeared. And that person was the defendant. Kendra stood. Objection. The courtroom froze. The silence was almost awkward. Daniels looked up slowly. On what grounds? He asked. Kendra's voice shook slightly. That's not a statement of fact. It's a conclusion based on circumstantial evidence. There's no direct proof I entered the vault room itself. Daniels arched an eyebrow. Doyle blinked, surprised. And from the back of the courtroom, Dylan Brooks, still silent, still unnoticed, smiled just a little. She's smarter than they think. Daniels nodded slowly. Sustained. Jury will disregard the attorney's phrasing. Doyle recovered, but the edge of his confidence had chipped slightly. During the recess, Kendra sat alone on the bench just outside the courtroom. She didn't check her phone. She didn't sip water. She simply sat, breathing shallowly, her hands clasped in her lap, like someone clinging to invisible anchors. Across from her, a group of journalists gathered around Bernard, firing off quiet questions. He fielded them with ease, even charisma, offering just enough for headlines, but not enough for liability. It's tragic, Bernard said in a low voice, knowing full well the nearby microphones would pick it up. She was like family, but sometimes you never truly know people. Kendra heard every word. She didn't flinch, but inside something cracked, not from shame, from grief, not for the sapphire, not even for herself, but for Ken, the boy she had raised like her own. He hadn't been at court once, the boy who used to run into her arms after nightmares, the boy who made her handmade Christmas cards, the boy who had once whispered, "I love you more than cookies, Auntie Ken." She had been more than a maid. She had been the one who made sure he brushed his teeth, who knew he liked strawberry jam without seeds, who knew how to soothe his asthma when he panicked, and now she hadn't seen him in 2 weeks. And back in court, Doyle played a pre-recorded video, a deposition taken from a former butler who had been dismissed months ago. She was always alone in that wing, the voice said. Always had access. Always lingered around the display cabinet. Did she ever talk about the sapphire? Doyle asked in the clip. She once said it looked like it didn't belong there. Gasps again. Doyle stopped the video. Miss Blake, do you deny making that statement? Kendra stood. No. I said that. So you admit you had thoughts about the gem. You found it. Tempting. Kendra looked directly at the jury now. I said it looked out of place, because it was. It sat behind glass in a child's bedroom, a gemstone worth millions in the same room where a little boy sleeps. That wasn't judgment. That was concern. Silence again. The real kind this time. Doyle's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He turned away. From the gallery, Dylan's fingers traced invisible lines on the armrest. There it was again. Not fear. Not manipulation. Conviction. Clarity. Pain. Yes, but not guilt. And yet, the court didn't care how she sounded. Courts cared about proof, about precedent, about paperwork, and Kendra had none of that. He exhaled slowly, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. This wasn't supposed to be his fight. He was retired. Hidden. He had done enough. But something about the way she spoke, the way her voice didn't tremble when she said she was worried for a child, "You were like family," Bernard had said. But families don't throw people away without listening. That night, Dylan sat alone in his truck outside the Kingsley estate. The security lights flickered near the gate. A delivery van pulled up and buzzed in without question. He watched quietly, noted the position of the cameras, the guard's shift change, the entrance to the West Wing, and then he looked down at the photo on his dashboard. Bella, age 9, her hair in braids, smiling with a gap-toothed grin. He tapped the steering wheel once. Sometimes he whispered, "Truth needs someone to carry it in on their back." By the time the moon rose over Los Angeles, the city lights shimmered like a galaxy scattered across the hills. But inside a small 2-bedroom cabin on the edge of Echo Park, a single desk lamp lit up a much smaller constellation, a tabletop covered in legal documents. Dylan Brooks sat hunched over the chaos like a man dissecting a living thing. His old military duffel had been emptied onto the floor court transcripts, JAG training binders, a half-broken laptop from a previous life. But at the center of it all was a thin packet of public evidence, downloaded from the county clerk's portal, the official filings in state of California, versus Kendra Blake. He flipped through the pages for the 3rd time that night. This doesn't line up. He leaned back, cracking his knuckles, eyes narrowed. The evidence summary contained 2 main exhibits. Exhibit A, digital entry logs, showing Kendra's keycard used at 9:16 p.m. Exhibit B, internal security footage from earlier that evening, up until 9:13 p.m., after which the cameras went mysteriously offline. What struck Dylan wasn't what was in the packet, it was what wasn't. There was no metadata accompanying the footage. No timestamps, he muttered. No file hashes. No chain of custody sign-off. That wasn't just sloppy. It was dangerous. He pulled out a yellowed training manual, military evidence protocol, chain of custody. He flipped to the section titled Electronic Surveillance Integrity. Digital evidence, it read, must be accompanied by system metadata and a verifiable access log. Without these, authenticity becomes vulnerable to manipulation. In military court, that alone could get an entire case thrown out. But this wasn't military court, and Kendra had no one to object. Dylan scribbled on a notepad. Footage ends 9:13 p.m. Entry 9:16 p.m. No camera. Gap. No chain. Breach. Reasonable doubt. He leaned back, rubbed his jaw. His fingers brushed against a small photo frame tucked near the lamp. Bella, age 6, in the picture, wearing her Halloween pirate costume. Smiling wide. One hand holding his, the other clutching a lollipop. He had spent years keeping her out of courtrooms, out of the headlines, out of the dark corners of a justice system that sometimes forgot the weight of a human soul. And yet, here he was. A man who'd once prosecuted war criminals on foreign soil, now knee-deep in a case about a missing gem, and a maid no one believed. But truth was never about the scale. It was about the principle. The next morning, Dylan sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse. Not a chain cafe, a quiet corner place where the barista knew how to leave people alone. His laptop open. Files spread around him. In front of him, an archived version of the estate's security vendor website. He had tracked it down from a footer link in the court filing. Holt Integrated Security Systems, he murmured. Standard system logs every 60 seconds, unless tampered. And there it was. In a maintenance manual buried on page 37, any loss of timestamp data during blackout must be accompanied by a reset authentication trail. He flipped back to Exhibit A. Nothing. No reset. No audit trail. Someone had pulled the plug and done it clean. Too clean, Dylan said. He sipped his coffee, pulled out a sticky note, wrote just one word. Deliberate. Court resumed that afternoon with witness testimony from the estate's IT technician, a man named Russell Dean. Nervous. Fidgety. Dylan sat in the gallery again, arms crossed. So Mr. Dean Carter Doyle said smoothly, "You maintain the security servers at the Kingsley estate." "Yes, sir. Can you confirm whether the footage was tampered with?" "No, sir. There was just a blackout. Happens sometimes. System hiccuped." Doyle turned to the jury. "And no sign of external access. Correct, correct." Kendra rose suddenly, her voice cut through like a blade. "May I ask a question, Your Honor?" The courtroom stiffened. Judge Daniels blinked. "You may." "Mr. Dean, what kind of system hiccup causes only one wing of a mansion to go dark for exactly 34 minutes right when $1 million gem goes missing?" Dean stammered. I don't know. Maybe a circuit overload. Was there a fire alarm? A trip in the breaker? Any incident logged?" Dean paused. "No, not that I recall." "So, nothing triggered the failure," Kendra said, her voice steady now. "And no log explains it. And no backup feed exists. And no technician was called. Is that?" Normal silence. Judge Daniels tilted his head. "You don't have to answer that," Mr. Dean Doyle said quickly. "No," Dean said almost to himself. "It's not normal." In the back row, Dylan closed his notebook slowly. "There it is," he whispered. "The first breach in the wall." That evening, Dylan made his way to the county archives. The staff had already closed for the day, but he had called in a favor, an old friend from his JAG days, who now worked at the DA's office. The man handed him a sealed envelope. "This is a copy of the original filing affidavit," he said, "from the Kingsley family. Took a little effort. It was sealed until last week." Dylan opened it, scanned the first page, paused. "No affidavit from law enforcement," he murmured. "All internal. Private statements. Private signatures. No police investigator listed." He flipped to the second page. "Filed directly by Bernard Kingsley, through personal legal counsel." He sat back. "They never called the police," he said aloud. "They built their own case, sealed it, and brought it straight to court. And that meant there was no independent verification, no forensic investigation, no government oversight. It was all contained, controlled." Dylan closed the folder, his pulse steady now. Not angry, not surprised. Just ready. "They didn't build a case," he whispered. "They built a story." The letter arrived on a Thursday morning. No return address, no signature. Just a plain white envelope slid under the courthouse clerk's door sometime before dawn. It might have been thrown out like so many crank messages sent to high-profile cases. But the clerk, a sharp-eyed woman named Marisol, had seen enough of those in her 20 years to know this one was different. Typed, single-spaced, printed on textured ivory stock. And most curious of all, folded with surgical precision, like a deposition brief. She brought it straight to Judge Daniels's chambers without logging it. And by mid-morning, the entire courtroom whispered about it. Kendra sat alone again at the defense table, eyes forward, lips pursed. The courtroom was quieter today. Tense. The kind of silence that comes after a storm has passed, but before people realize another one is forming. Judge Daniels held the letter in his hands. "An anonymous document has been submitted to the court," he announced, tone flat but weighted. "It alleges material information pertaining to this case." He paused. His eyes flicked toward Kendra. "I have reviewed the contents privately. It references events involving a third-party one who is not currently on any witness list. The court does not yet verify its authenticity." Kendra leaned forward. "Who sent it?" she asked. Daniels shook his head. "The letter is unsigned. No identifying markers." "What does it say?" Daniels hesitated, then read aloud. "During my employment at the Kingsley residence, I witnessed a verbal altercation between Margaret Kingsley and her son Bernard. The subject of the argument was the sapphire, specifically its placement in the vault wing. Margaret claimed the gem rightfully belonged to her side of the family and expressed resentment at Bernard's public control of it. Following the argument, I observed Margaret leaving the west wing late at night. I later discovered a small latch hidden behind the fireplace panel in the old study, an area long unused. I believe this may be a storage location. I was too afraid to report what I saw at the time. I regret my silence. The room held its breath. Daniels folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. This testimony, if verified, would contradict the assumption that only the defendant had motive or access. Dylan Brooks, seated in the gallery, didn't move. But inside, something shifted. That writing style. It wasn't frantic, wasn't emotional. It was structured. The phrasing, "I regret my silence," the word, "choice material information." Verbal altercation may be a storage location. That's not a scared maid. That's someone who studied law, or lived around it. And whoever they are, they're trying to whisper from the shadows. He jotted 3 words in his notebook: witness, willing, watching. After court adjourned for the day, Dylan lingered outside. Kendra stepped through the main doors, slowly squinting against the mid-afternoon sun. She was thinner now, paler, but still upright. He walked beside her without asking. "That letter," he said, keeping his voice low. It wasn't written by chance. She didn't look at him, just kept walking. "I know," she said. "I saw the way the judge read it." "Do you know who it could be?" Kendra hesitated, then barely above a whisper, "Davy." Dylan waited. There was a woman named Bonnie, older, housekeeper. Worked there for 15 years. Retired suddenly last year, no notice. No farewell. Just gone. "And you think she knew something?" Kendra nodded slowly. She was the only one who ever questioned Margaret. "She once told me, 'That gem doesn't belong in a boy's bedroom. It belongs in a museum.'" Dylan's eyes narrowed. "Do you know where she went?" "Last I heard, somewhere near Santa Clarita, but she never left a number. Said, 'When rich people decide you're a threat, silence is the only protection.'" Dylan stopped walking. "Can you get me a last name?" Kendra finally looked up at him. "Why are you doing this?" he exhaled. Looked past her toward the courthouse columns now glowing in afternoon light. "Because they're building a narrative, and you're standing in the middle of it alone. That's how they win. They isolate, then they bury." She studied him. "You're not just some guy in the gallery, are you?" A pause. "No," Dylan said quietly. "I was JAG Corps, Navy Legal Command. So why aren't you in a courtroom anymore?" His jaw clenched. "Because I used to think justice and truth were the same thing. And then I watched a man get court-martialed for a crime I proved he didn't commit. They cleared him 3 years later. He didn't live to hear it." Kendra stood still. "So why now? Why me?" He looked her dead in the eye. "Because you're not lying, and no one else gives a damn." That night, Dylan sat at his dining table with his laptop open and coffee gone cold. A simple search turned up 5 retired domestic employees from the Kingsley estate. One name caught his eye: Bonnie Strickland. Age 62. Last known address, Valencia, CA. A 1-bedroom duplex off a quiet cul-de-sac. He copied the address, shut the laptop, and stood. Time to knock on a door that didn't want to be opened. Meanwhile, back at the Kingsley estate, Margaret Kingsley stood in the shadows of the West Wing hallway, staring at a long-forgotten portrait. In her hand, she held a second letter, an exact copy of the one sent to the court. Her fingers tightened around it. "Foolish old woman," she whispered. "You should have stayed gone." She walked slowly to the old study. The fireplace there hadn't been lit in years. She knelt, pressed her fingers against the back panel, and listened. The courthouse felt colder that morning. Maybe it was the rain tapping against the stained glass windows. Maybe it was the way the fluorescent lights flickered above the defense table like warning signs. Or maybe it was the silence, the unbearable, suffocating silence that followed Kendra Blake everywhere now. She sat with her hands folded tightly, as if prayer might keep the weight of it all from caving in. Across the aisle, Bernard Kingsley adjusted his cufflinks as calm as ever. His legal team was lined up like chess pieces, Doyle in front, 2 junior attorneys behind, and a paralegal furiously flipping through pages. The prosecution was about to call its star witness, a former nanny, who would claim that Kendra had once expressed jealousy over not being treated like family. She said it wasn't fair, the witness had told investigators. She did all the work, but Margaret called her staff, not family. She seemed bitter. Bitterness, Doyle would argue, was motive, and motive, as he liked to remind the jury, was everything. Judge Daniels entered. Court is now in session. Kendra stood, her eyes locked on the wood grain of the table in front of her. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Sleep had become something abstract, a memory from another life. As Doyle rose to call the nanny to the stand, Kendra suddenly spoke. "Your Honor." The room paused. Daniels turned to her. "Yes, Miss Blake." She stood slowly, each breath deliberate. "I'd like to withdraw my plea." Daniels tilted his head. "You haven't entered a formal plea yet, Miss Blake. Then I'd like to plead guilty." A collective gasp moved through the courtroom like a shiver. Even Doyle blinked. "You wish to enter a guilty plea," Daniels clarified. "Yes, sir." "Are you doing so voluntarily?" "I am." "Why?" Daniels asked gently. Kendra swallowed hard. "Because no one believes me, and I can't fight them alone anymore." Her voice cracked on the last word. Just a tremor. But enough. She wasn't sobbing. She was breaking quietly and in full view of a courtroom that had done nothing but stare. And then a voice spoke, not loud, but solid, grounded, clear. "Objection, Your Honor." Every head turned. From the back of the courtroom, a man in a worn green military jacket rose to his feet. "Dylan Brooks." Judge Daniels squinted. "Sir, this is a closed matter between the defendant and the court." Dylan stepped forward. "I have standing." "Who are you?" Daniels asked. Dylan reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim, leather-bound folder. He walked down the center aisle with steady, measured steps. Not rushed, not unsure. At the prosecution table, Doyle leaned toward Bernard. "What the hell is this?" Dylan handed the folder to the bailiff who brought it to the judge. "Dylan Michael Brooks," he said. "Former Captain U.S. Navy, Judge Advocate General's Corps, California Bar, number 29844. I request immediate recognition as counsel for the defense." Daniels flipped open the folder. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Your credentials check out, but this court has not been notified of representation." "Because I hadn't decided to take the case," Dylan said. "Until now." Kendra stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. He turned to her. His voice softened, but it filled the room. "Because the truth shouldn't die just because it's standing alone." A flurry of objections came from Doyle, but Daniels overruled them. The defendant has the right to counsel at any stage before conviction. Captain Brooks is licensed, experienced, and frankly, this court is overdue for balance. He turned to Kendra. "Do you wish to accept Captain Brooks as your attorney of record?" Kendra didn't hesitate. "Yes, I do." Dylan walked slowly to the defense table. As he sat beside her, he leaned close. "We're not going to win this on emotion," he murmured. "We're going to win it on logic. You follow my lead." She nodded. "Good." Dylan stood, buttoned his jacket, and faced the courtroom. "Your Honor, I request that the court vacate the defendant's verbal plea attempt as it was made under duress and without counsel." "Granted," Daniels replied. Dylan turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, You've been presented with a story. A compelling one, a dramatic one. But you haven't seen evidence. Not real evidence. Not the kind that holds up when you push against it. He walked past Doyle, not even glancing at him. Over the next few days, you're going to hear testimony. Some of it will sound convincing. Some of it will sound emotional. But I'm going to ask you to look past that to look at the gaps, because there are gaps. Gaps in time. Gaps in access. Gaps in chain of custody. He stopped in front of them. And gaps create doubt. And in our justice system, doubt means you do not destroy someone's life. He returned to his seat. As the jury absorbed his words, Daniels called a recess for lunch. Outside, Kendra pulled him aside in the hallway. "I thought you were just watching," she said quietly. "I didn't know you were that. I used to be. Why now? Why me?" He looked at her, really looked. "Because when I watched you almost plead guilty, I realized something. This case doesn't just need a defense, it needs a reckoning." Back inside the courtroom, Bernard Kingsley stood with arms folded, staring through the glass doors. "Find out everything you can about that man," he told Doyle. "Already on it." Bernard's jaw tightened. "We had this case wrapped, tied with a bow." Doyle nodded, until someone walked in with a knife. There was a change in the courtroom now. Subtle, but real. Where once Kendra Blake had sat like a shadow, mute, invisible, prejudged, she now sat with Dylan Brooks beside her. And though he spoke little, his presence alone shifted the balance in the air, like a lever sliding into place on an old rusted scale. He didn't bring a briefcase. He didn't shuffle through piles of paper. He just brought his mind, and it was sharp as a scalpel. "Call your next witness," Judge Daniels instructed. Prosecutor Carter Doyle stood. "The prosecution calls Thomas Greaves, head of estate security for the Kingsley residence. A tall man with graying temples and stiff posture made his way to the stand. He wore a tailored navy blue suit and answered the oath with practiced calm. Doyle wasted no time. "Mr. Greaves, please describe your security system and your discovery of the missing sapphire." "We use Holt Integrated Top Tier. Full perimeter biometric access on all vault doors. On the evening of the theft, I reviewed the overnight logs. Miss Blake's keycard was the only one used in the West Wing during the window of time when the gem went missing." Doyle turned toward the jury like a director setting a scene. "So to clarify, only one person entered the corridor where the gem was stored." "Correct. And that person is sitting right there." "Yes." Doyle smiled, faintly stepping aside. No further questions. Dylan rose. He walked toward the witness stand, with the slow, deliberate gait of a man, not rushing, but hunting. "Mr. Greaves," he said calmly, "how long have you worked for the Kingsley family? 9 years? In that time, how many false alarms or camera failures have occurred in the West Wing?" Greaves hesitated. "A handful." "Define a handful." "Maybe 5. In 9 years." "So, 1 every 2 years approximately." "Interesting," Dylan said, pacing slightly. "Because the prosecution claims this blackout was just a hiccup. Yet it occurred coincidentally during the exact 34-minute window when a priceless family gem disappeared." Greaves stiffened. "I don't control the system's glitches." "No, but you are responsible for documenting them. So, can you present the incident report for that particular outage?" A pause. There wasn't one. "No internal report, no." "Did you alert Holt Integrated?" "No." Dylan raised an eyebrow, turning to the jury. "So just to be clear, the estate's top security officer, overseeing a multi-million-dollar property, discovered a 34-minute surveillance failure. On the same night, a family heirloom vanished and filed 0 paperwork." Greaves fumbled slightly. It didn't seem necessary at the time. "Ah," Dylan said. voice tightening so the absence of cameras, the absence of incident reports, and the absence of chain of custody logs all occurred at the same time as the absence of the gem. He paused. "That's a lot of absence, Mr. Greaves." A ripple of laughter stirred through the gallery. Even Judge Daniels couldn't hide the flicker of amusement. Dylan turned away, but then pivoted back with sudden precision. "Tell me, how is access to the West Wing logged keycards time-stamped? And the server storing those logs, is it accessible by any household staff?" "No, only the estate's IT admin and myself." Dylan nodded. "So in theory, if someone wanted to frame another staff member, they'd only need access to the system," Objection Doyle said. "Speculative. Withdrawn," Dylan said instantly. No further questions. As Greaves stepped down, Dylan sat beside Kendra. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "You didn't just poke holes," she whispered. "You pulled threads." "Just enough," Dylan replied, "to make the fabric look stitched." The next witness was a former housemaid named Leanne Young, and nervously polite. Doyle led her gently. "Miss Leanne, did you ever witness Miss Blake speak bitterly about her employment?" She was quiet mostly, but yes. Once she said she felt like she wasn't family, that she was invisible. "And did she ever talk about the gem?" she said. "It felt strange to have something so expensive in a child's bedroom." "Thank you." No further questions. Dylan stood slowly. "Miss Leanne, how long did you work at the Kingsley estate?" "About 10 months. So less than 1 year?" "Yes." "Did you ever see Miss Blake steal anything?" "No." "Did you ever hear her threaten anyone?" "No." "Did she ever confide in you about money struggles?" Leanne shook her head. "She never talked about herself. You said she called herself invisible. What did you mean by that?" "I think she meant people looked through her, like she didn't matter." "Do you believe she stole the sapphire Doyle rose?" Objection irrelevant. Daniels considered. Overruled. She may answer. Leanne looked down at her lap, then back up at Dylan. "No," she said softly. "I don't." The courtroom exhaled. It wasn't a bombshell, but it was a crack, a subtle shift, a whisper of humanity piercing the fog of presumption. Outside during recess, Bernard fumed behind tinted windows in his black SUV. "This lawyer," he growled to Doyle. "Where did he come from? He's ex-military. Smart. But he's not press-trained. If we push him into a media spotlight—" "No," Bernard interrupted. "Media won't help. This needs containment. You want me to push harder? I want you to remind the court that we are the victims, that she stole from us. This isn't about sympathy, it's about power. We don't lose in court. Ever." Doyle nodded, lips tight. But as the SUV pulled away, even he knew that wasn't entirely true anymore. There are silences that scream louder than any witness. And that morning, the silence came from a child. Ken Kingsley, age 7, blue-eyed, once inseparable from Kendra, had not appeared in court once. Not even in the gallery. Not even hidden behind tinted glass. For a boy who used to fall asleep on her lap, who once painted her a birthday card with stars and glue and proudly misspelled the word family, the absence spoke volumes. And yet no one had said a word about it. Until now. Back at the cabin, Bella Brooks tapped her pencil rhythmically against the breakfast table. She didn't like the quiet either. Not this kind. Her father, usually steady and unreadable, was staring into the middle distance, with that same crease between his brow she recognized from his before-court face. "Dad," she asked. Do kids have to tell the truth in court?" Dylan blinked out of his haze. "They do, if they're old enough to understand the difference between truth and lie. And if they're scared," he looked at her now. "Sharp. Why are you asking?" Bella hesitated, then reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "Ken gave me this. Yesterday. After school. He said not to tell anybody. Dylan unfolded it. It was a drawing. Crayon on lined notebook paper. Kendra stood in the middle arms, a sad smile on her face. To her right, a little boy, unmistakably Ken, was standing beside a tall woman in pearls and a gray dress. Her face was twisted, cartoonishly angry. A speech bubble floated above her head. "Don't say a word, or you'll be sent away like your father." And underneath, in Ken's shaky but careful handwriting, Auntie Kendra didn't take it. "I know." But Grandma said not to speak. Dylan froze. He studied the paper again. Slowly. "Bella, did you tell anyone else?" "No, I promised." "But he looked so sad when he gave it to me." "You did the right thing." He kissed her forehead and stood. "I need to go." At the courthouse, Dylan arrived 15 minutes before the session. He entered through the side corridor where the press rarely ventured. He carried the drawing in a thin sealed folder. Inside the courtroom, he approached the bench in private conference before the jury was seated. "Your Honor, I need to bring a matter to the court's attention, in chambers, if possible." Judge Daniels looked at him. "Is it evidentiary?" "Yes." "And sensitive. It involves a minor." Doyle bristled. "This is highly irregular, so is threatening a child." Dylan cut in calm but ice-edged. Daniels's expression changed. "Both counsel. Chambers. Now." 10 minutes later, behind closed doors, Dylan placed the drawing on the judge's desk. Daniels examined it in silence. Doyle leaned forward. "This is hearsay. It's a first-hand expression from the minor most connected to the accused." Dylan replied. "Drawn without coaching. No adult knowledge. And it names a specific threat made by a guardian, Margaret Kingsley." Doyle frowned. "It's still inadmissible. Maybe in a vacuum," Dylan said. "But add it to motive access and the anonymous letter from last week." Suddenly, this isn't just a drawing. It's patterned intimidation. Daniels exhaled through his nose. "This child's statement is protected, but the implications are real. I'm authorizing a preliminary inquiry into Margaret Kingsley's influence on the minor. Any evidence of coercion, and I will open the door to testimonial exceptions." Doyle paled. Outside, as the court reconvened, the tension was thicker than usual. Kendra hadn't said a word. But when Dylan sat beside her and gently tapped the folder, once her eyes widened. "You found Ken," she whispered. He didn't nod, didn't smile, just whispered back, "He found us." Later that day, Dylan met quietly with a court-appointed child advocate. By order of Judge Daniels, Ken would be interviewed off-site under supervision. And for the first time, the boy was allowed to speak freely. No Margaret, no Bernard, no lawyers hovering. The transcript came back sealed, but one sentence stood out like a thunderclap in a rainstorm. Grandma put something behind the firewall in the old study. She said no one would believe a kid anyway. That evening, Kendra sat on the courthouse steps long after the sun had dipped below the skyline. Dylan joined her. Neither spoke for a long time. He remembers everything she said at last, even the quiet things. Dylan nodded. Kids always do. They just wait for someone to listen. Do you think the court will allow it? Eventually. But even if they don't, we now have grounds and a timeline. And if that fireplace holds what I think it holds, this case isn't just shifting, it's collapsing. Kendra turned to him. Her voice was quiet. Small. You're not just saving me. No, he said. You're saving him too. Back at the Kingsley estate in the velvet dusk of the West Wing, Margaret Kingsley poured herself a glass of white wine. She stared into the fire that hadn't been lit in years. She knew it wouldn't hold forever. Not the bricks. Not the secrets. Certainly not the boy. Foolish child, she whispered. Then she sipped her wine and waited. The morning air was crisp, electric, like the moment before a storm cracks the sky. Dylan Brooks stood before the bench, jaw firm, documents in hand, eyes calm, like a man lighting a fuse he built himself. Behind him, Kendra sat straighter than usual. She didn't know what he was about to do, but she trusted him now. More than that, she believed in him. "Your Honor," Dylan began, voice measured the defense files a formal motion under Title 18, Section 3500J, referencing California Evidence Code 1054.3, specifically the provision allowing court-ordered inspection of private property when material evidence may exist to assist in a fair trial. Judge Daniels blinked. Slowly. So did Carter Doyle. "That statute pertains to defense witness access," Doyle said, standing immediately. "It doesn't authorize trespassing into private family homes." "Correct," Dylan said. "Which is why the defense is not requesting trespass. We're requesting court-ordered supervised inspection with an officer present, based on a sworn statement by a minor witness and corroborated anonymous testimony, both indicating the potential location of concealed physical evidence directly relevant to this case." Daniels leaned back, steepling his fingers. "You're referring to the old study?" "Yes, Your Honor. Specifically the space behind the fireplace wall, a location described by both the child and an anonymous letter." Doyle laughed once too loud. "We're hunting ghost compartments now. What's next?" "Seance testimony." Daniels didn't smile. He looked down at the motion. "This is legally sound." Doyle's face fell. "Excuse me. You cited the exact provision yourself in a fraud case 4 years ago, Mr. Doyle." Daniels replied coolly. "In People v. Harland, you used it to gain access to a suspect's wine cellar. I ruled in your favor, as I recall." A beat of silence. Then, motion granted. By noon, a sheriff's deputy, a neutral investigator, and a court clerk arrived at the Kingsley estate. So did Dylan. Bernard Kingsley stood at the top of the marble staircase, arms folded, cold fury radiating from every pore. "This is harassment," he spat. "You're violating the sanctity of my home." "Sir," the deputy said firmly, "you've been served by the court. Refusal to comply will result in contempt proceedings." Bernard held his ground for 3 beats, then turned with a sharp flick of his coat and disappeared down the corridor. The old study smelled of dust and old smoke, not just from the fireplace, but from decades of secrets. The walls were lined with aging books, some titles faded, some spines broken. The hearth was tall, stone-lined, and cool to the touch. Dylan knelt before it, running his hand along the bottom brick. He tapped twice, then paused. There a faint click. "Here," he said. With the deputy's supervision, he gently removed a loose panel. Behind it, a metal cavity. Inside, a sealed leather pouch, brittle with age. He opened it carefully. Inside was the Kingsley sapphire, and folded beneath it a handwritten note, ink faded but legible. "Secure until further notice. Keep house clean. No mistakes. She leaves before Thanksgiving. M.K." Back at the courthouse, Daniels stared at the evidence placed before him. "Is this authenticated?" he asked. The court clerk nodded. "Initial testing confirms the gem matches the insurance documentation for the Kingsley sapphire," the handwriting Dylan asked. "Submitted for forensic comparison," the clerk said. "But the initials, location, and phrasing align with both the anonymous letter and Ken's drawing." The courtroom had gone stone silent. Doyle was white as chalk. Kendra sat frozen. Dylan stood. "Your Honor?" This vault wasn't just a hiding place. It was a plan. The note makes it clear this wasn't theft. This was orchestration. A controlled setup to remove Miss Blake from the household permanently. And the gem, it never left the property. He turned slowly toward the jury. They didn't want justice. They wanted narrative. An invisible scapegoat. Someone who didn't fight back. He rested his hands on the defense table. Until now. Judge Daniels exhaled and looked toward the prosecutor. Mr. Doyle, do you wish to continue prosecution? Doyle's voice was small. The people respectfully request a recess to reconsider their position. Daniels nodded. Granted. Court will reconvene tomorrow morning. He turned to Kendra. You may stand down, Miss Blake. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed like bees. Kendra walked down the steps in a daze, shielded on one side by Dylan on the other, by the courthouse security officer. Cameras flashed. Voices shouted questions. But all she heard was the word found. Someone said it behind a camera. She hadn't heard that word in weeks. That night, Dylan stood outside the cabin staring at the stars. Kendra sat beside him on the porch swing. Neither said much for a long time. Did you ever think you'd do this again? She asked softly. Law? He asked. Yeah. No. Why not? He took a long breath, because I was tired of watching people lose to stories instead of truth. Thought I'd be better off fixing trucks raising my kid. So what changed? He turned toward her. You. Inside, Bella set 2 cups of cocoa on the table and added 1 extra marshmallow to each her silent ritual for good days that started bad. In her backpack, the drawing from Ken now rested between 2 books, a quiet piece of art. That started an earthquake. There was a different kind of silence in the courtroom that morning. Not the silence of tension. Not the silence of fear. But the kind that comes when truth is close enough to touch, and everyone, including the powerful, begins to sweat beneath their tailored suits. Kendra Blake sat straighter now, still quiet, still composed, but no longer alone. She was no longer the woman the jury pitied. She was the woman they had started to see. And beside her sat Dylan Brooks, steady focused and sharpening his final blade. Judge Daniels adjusted his glasses. Mr. Brooks, you may proceed with your summation. Dylan stood slowly buttoning the front of his jacket. He didn't walk toward the jury box right away. Instead, he walked to the evidence cart, rested his hand on the sealed evidence pouch that held the Kingsley sapphire. And then, he just looked at it, as if to remind the court this was never about a gem. Then he turned. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, his voice was quiet, conversational. You've heard a lot in the past 10 days. Security logs, witnesses, depositions, expert testimonies, words wrapped in suits and power. He paused. But I want to bring you back to something simple. A question you probably had on day 1 and were told not to ask. He stepped toward them. If the gem was stolen, why wasn't law enforcement called immediately? A beat of silence. Why was there no police investigation? No forensic sweep? No standard procedures followed, despite a supposed high-value theft? Instead, they called private security, did an internal review, and weeks later filed charges based solely on internal logs and subjective assumptions. He walked, and now we know why. Because the gem was never missing. He held up a copy of the discovery order. It was hidden, behind a fireplace wall, inside a private study, sealed in a pouch, marked with instructions to have Miss Blake removed from the household. He looked directly at Bernard Kingsley. This wasn't theft. This was theater. Doyle rose. Objection. Argumentative. Judge Daniels didn't flinch. Overruled. Continue, Mr. Brooks. Dylan turned back to the jury. Now I'm going to do something risky. I'm going to assume that you've been watching, not just listening. That you've seen how the people in power in this room have behaved, and that you can smell when a story doesn't add up. He clicked a small remote. A screen lit up with the entry log. The prosecution claims this log proves opportunity. that Kendra entered the West Wing at 9:16 p.m. and left at 9:47. What they didn't explain is why the security footage for those exact minutes went offline. He clicked again. Split screen. Left image of the blackout window. Right. Holt Integrated System Manual. Highlighted blackout events exceeding 30 seconds require logged reset protocol. No reset protocol. No system error report. No audit trail. He stepped toward Doyle's table now. Their entire case depends on a narrative, with no proof, and when we finally followed the thread to the truth, thanks to the courage of a child and an anonymous letter, what did we find? He tapped the screen again. An image of the sapphire, the pouch, the handwritten note, that the only plan in this case belonged to the people pointing fingers. Then he stopped, let silence fall, just for a moment, and then said, "Now, let's talk about intent." He turned to face the judge. "Your Honor, as the court well knows, in order for a theft conviction to stand, 3 conditions must be met: unlawful, taking intent to permanently deprive, and lack of consent." He looked back to the jury. There was no taking. The gem was still on the property. There was no intent, no gain, no motive, and no credible timeline of events. He held up a final sheet, the statement from Ken lightly redacted. "And here's the voice no one wanted you to hear. The child whose trust in Miss Blake was weaponized to silence him, who watched his grandmother threaten him into submission, who drew what he couldn't say aloud." He paused. That drawing in any honest court should have ended this case days ago. Doyle stood, tried to recover. This is emotional manipulation. No Dylan cut in smoothly. That's what you tried when you called her bitter, when you turned every act of humility into guilt, when you told the court that silence equals confession. He stepped back to his table. But sometimes silence is the last defense of the innocent. Judge Daniels looked toward the prosecution. "Mr. Doyle, do you have any rebuttal?" Doyle cleared his throat, but the words didn't come. Even he could see the tide was gone, the current broken, the case unraveling like a cheap suit in summer rain. "No rebuttal, Your Honor." Daniels nodded solemnly. "Then we will recess for jury deliberation." The gavel struck once. Court adjourned. Outside, the sun was already climbing high. Kendra stood beside Dylan on the marble steps, blinking against the light. For the first time, she wasn't shielding her eyes. "What if they still convict me?" she asked. Dylan looked at her. "Then the system's more broken than I thought." A pause. "But I don't think they will." She looked down at her hands. "I don't even care about the verdict anymore." "You should." "No," she said, "because I already got something back." "What's that?" She looked at him, eyes brimming but not with fear this time. "My name." Across the plaza, Bernard Kingsley sat in the back of a black SUV, staring through the tinted window at the courthouse doors. His phone buzzed. "What now?" he snapped. The voice on the line was tense. The media just got the photo of the pouch, the handwriting, the initials. Bernard's jaw clenched. "Let them print it," he muttered. "By tomorrow, no one will remember." But deep down, he knew. This time they would. The courtroom was electric, not loud, not chaotic, but crackling with something deeper. The sense that something real was about to happen, that justice long denied was finally taking shape in front of them. And when the jury returned after only 2 hours of deliberation, the shift in the room was palpable. No one whispered. No one moved. Even Bernard Kingsley, usually so composed, tapped one finger rhythmically against the armrest of his leather chair. Kendra Blake sat perfectly still, not because she was calm, but because her entire world was balanced on a razor's edge. And beside her, Dylan Brooks leaned forward, elbows on the table, Eyes locked on the foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Daniels asked. "We have, Your Honor." "Please rise." Everyone stood. The clerk took the envelope and handed it to the judge, who read it silently, then passed it back. In the matter of State of California, Kendra Blake on the charge of felony grand theft. How do you find the defendant? The foreperson cleared her throat. Not guilty. The words dropped like a bell. And then silence, stillness, then sobs. Quiet, from Kendra's chest. And then a sound from the gallery, a gasp, then the beginning of applause before the judge banged his gavel. Order, this is still a court of law. But his tone had softened. Doyle's head dropped. And Dylan, he just closed his eyes for a breath. Then placed a steady hand over Kendra's shaking fingers. Daniels cleared his throat. "Miss Blake, you are fully acquitted of all charges. You are free to leave this courtroom without prejudice or condition. Your record will reflect full exoneration." Kendra opened her mouth, but no sound came. Instead, she turned to Dylan, eyes wide. Wet. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me," he said. "Thank the truth. It showed up." They stepped out into a wall of flashbulbs. The steps of the courthouse were no longer stone, they were a stage. But Dylan didn't flinch. He stepped in front of the cameras like a man who had done this in another life, only now with more weight behind his words. "Today wasn't just about a missing gem," he said. "It was about the kind of people we become when no one's looking. About how silence can be used as a weapon or as a shield. And it was about a woman who never stopped telling the truth even when no one listened." Beside him, Kendra stood upright. Her hands didn't tremble anymore. Then a voice pierced the crowd. "Auntie Kendra." A small blur broke through the reporters, a boy in a blazer and untucked dress shirt. "Ken." Kendra dropped to her knees before the boy reached her. He flew into her arms. Tears ran down her cheeks as he clutched her around the neck. "I knew you didn't do it," he sobbed. "I knew it. The cameras caught it all. And this time, it wasn't shame they broadcast. It was truth." Inside the courthouse, in a hallway, lined with quiet portraits of retired judges, Margaret Kingsley stood alone. An officer approached her with a folded document. "Ma'am, the court has issued an order for questioning. Under suspicion of obstruction, witness tampering, and filing false claims." She didn't speak, didn't blink, just took the paper, and walked slowly away. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Los Angeles skyline, Dylan parked his truck outside the Kingsley estate, not to confront, not to gloat, but to return something. He carried a small velvet box in his hand. Inside, the Kingsley sapphire, now sealed in an evidence bag, but released to its legal owners. He was met at the gate by Bernard himself. "I could have buried you," Bernard said coldly. Dylan looked him in the eye. "You tried." Bernard took the box, but before he turned to leave, Dylan added, "You know, the jewel's not what'll stain your name. It's the note, the wall, the kid." Bernard paused. "He'll forget." "No," Dylan said, "but he'll remember who stood up." Later that night, back at the cabin, Dylan found Kendra sitting on the back porch, sipping tea in silence. Bella and Ken were inside playing checkers on the floor like they'd been best friends for years. The air was quiet, still. Healing. "It's over," she whispered. "Almost," Dylan said. "What do you mean?" He sat beside her, looked out at the stars. "Now we figure out what comes next." In the weeks that followed, the headlines burned across media Maid, framed by billionaire family. Acquitted child secret drawing saves day. Veteran lawyer returns from retirement, wins case against all odds. But Dylan turned down every interview. So did Kendra. Instead, they turned their focus towards something else, something bigger. They leased an old building near downtown, hung a small wooden sign outside. The Clara Foundation, justice for the voiceless. On the wall behind the reception desk, framed in a simple oak frame, hung Ken's original drawing. Still wrinkled. Still in crayon. Still powerful. Because in the end, it wasn't the sapphire that changed everything. It was the boy who found the courage to draw the truth, and the man who knew how to fight for it. For the first time in weeks, the courtroom wasn't filled with fear. It was filled with anticipation, not for guilt, not for punishment, but for closure. The air was thick, not with accusation, but with something far more rare reckoning. On the defense bench, Kendra Blake sat in a simple black dress. No uniform, no apron. Just herself, quiet, centered, and whole. To her right, Dylan Brooks sat in his military green jacket, sleeves rolled, a file closed before him. He wasn't flipping through arguments today. He'd already spoken the truth. Now the system had to answer. The bailiff opened the chamber door. All eyes turned. Margaret Kingsley entered slowly, not with her usual smug dignity, but with a tight jaw and narrowed eyes. Her pearls were still around her neck, but they no longer looked regal. They looked out of place, like relics from a world that thought it was immune. She sat beside her attorney, silent. Bernard Kingsley across the aisle didn't speak either. For once, he was just present, not performing, not posing, just sitting in the world he'd tried to shape, now reshaped by the very people he dismissed. Judge Daniels entered and took his seat. This court convenes today not to reopen a verdict, but to consider post-trial proceedings and formal charges regarding obstruction, witness tampering, and perjury. He looked over his glasses toward Margaret. Specifically, charges arising from newly discovered evidence that the court finds credible and compelling. He tapped his gavel once. Proceedings begin now. The prosecutor stood. This time, not Doyle, but a court-appointed special counsel. Your Honor, we present evidence that Margaret Kingsley did willfully conceal material evidence, namely the Kingsley sapphire, with intent to mislead this court and to orchestrate a narrative resulting in false criminal accusation. She tapped the evidence table. We further submit audio from a voicemail recovered from a housekeeper's phone, in which Ms. Kingsley stated, "She'll never see it again, and the boy will stay quiet if he knows what's good for him." A wave moved through the court like a slow shock. Margaret didn't flinch, but her lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor," he said, rising, "my client declines to make a statement at this time." "She may remain silent," Daniels replied, "but the evidence will speak." He turned to Kendra. "Miss Blake, is there anything you wish to say before I render judgment?" The room quieted. Kendra stood. She didn't read from notes. She didn't rehearse. She simply spoke from a place most people spend their lives trying to reach the raw truth of surviving injustice with grace. "I was never angry," she said. "Not really. I was hurt, betrayed, made small in a house I gave everything to. But I wasn't angry until I saw what they were willing to do to a child." Her voice tightened. "I don't want vengeance. I don't want headlines. I want to live in a world where people don't need a war hero to speak for them in court, where truth doesn't depend on money." She looked at Dylan. "But I'm grateful that when I needed one, someone stood up." The gallery was silent. Even the court stenographer had paused, hands hovering above the keys, as if recording the moment too quickly might cheapen it. Judge Daniels cleared his throat. "Thank you, Miss Blake." He turned back to the bench. "Based on the evidence and this court's independent review, I am issuing the following rulings. 1. A formal apology is entered into court record on behalf of the state of California to Kendra Blake, who was wrongly prosecuted due to fabricated narratives and privileged manipulation. 2 charges of perjury, obstruction of justice, and child intimidation are filed against Margaret Kingsley, effective immediately. 3. Mr. Bernard Kingsley is ordered to issue a public apology under sworn affidavit for his role in the submission of false claims. Bernard stirred. Your Honor, I'd like to make that apology now. Daniels raised an eyebrow. You may. Bernard stood slowly, turned not to the judge, but to Kendra, Miss Blake. He paused. The words didn't come easily. What I allowed was beneath the standard of any decent man. I let fear of embarrassment justify something unforgivable. A longer pause. You weren't staff. You were family. My grandson's family. And I failed him. And you, his voice broke. I'm sorry. Then he sat. The judge nodded once. Let the record show the apology has been made and accepted. He struck the gavel. This hearing is closed. Outside there were no flashbulbs this time, no media swarm, just sunlight pouring onto the courthouse steps. Dylan and Kendra walked out together. This time, no one followed. But just as they reached the sidewalk, a woman in a modest navy blazer approached. Excuse me, she said. I just wanted to say thank you. My sister went through something like this last year. She didn't have anyone. Watching you two, it gave me hope. Kendra smiled gently. That's why we're building the foundation. The Clara Foundation, right? Dylan nodded. Doors open next month. First clients are already calling. The woman smiled, eyes glassy. I'll be one of them. That night, Dylan tucked Bella into bed. She clutched her stuffed fox, yawning. Did we win? She asked sleepily. He brushed hair from her forehead. We did. Did she get her name back? She did. That's better than money, right? Dylan smiled. Way better. Across town, Kendra walked into her new office. It was small, humble, a single hallway, a few chairs. But on the wall near the door hung two things. One, a framed copy of her court exoneration order. Two, a child's drawing, laminated now but still wrinkled. Kendra looked at it for a long time, then turned off the lights and locked the door. Tomorrow was a new beginning, 3 months later. A gray morning sun stretched across downtown Los Angeles, spilling light through high windows and bouncing off glass towers. But tucked between two older buildings, on a quiet street, sat a renovated brick storefront. Its name, painted in soft gold lettering on the frosted glass door, read, The Clara Foundation Justice. Dignity. Voice. Inside the walls were warm wood and gentle ivory. No metal. No cold tile. Just softness. Just light. In the waiting area there were no rows of plastic chairs, no clipped magazines, only a coffee station, a jar of colored pencils, and a small bookshelf filled with children's stories, legal guides, and survivor memoirs. It didn't look like a law office. It looked like a place someone might go to breathe. Kendra Blake stood near the reception desk, organizing intake files. Her name was stitched in elegant script on a small pin program director. She wore simple black slacks and a soft blue blouse. Nothing formal, nothing stiff. Her hair was pinned up loosely, a small silver earring catching the morning light. She looked for the first time in a long time, unburdened. You're early, said a voice behind her. She turned. Dylan Brooks stepped through the door, holding a tray with 2 steaming cups of coffee and a paper bag. His green military jacket was replaced with a dark gray cardigan. He still moved like a soldier, quietly, efficiently, but there was a softness in his shoulders now. A peace. You didn't have to bring coffee, Kendra said. I did, he replied, handing her the cup. Because today's important. They're just walk-ins. Not to them. He set the bag on the desk. Blueberry muffins, Bella insisted. Said, therefore, the people who made the monsters go away. Kendra smiled, eyes misting. She's got your instincts. And your heart, Dylan said. They stood in silence for a beat. Then the door opened behind them. A young woman stepped in, maybe early 20s, nervous, carrying a toddler on her hip, a manila folder tucked under her arm like armor. She looked around slowly. Kendra stepped forward with a warm smile. "Hi," she said. "Welcome. You're safe here. Let's sit and talk." That afternoon, Dylan stood in the corner of the office watching as Kendra listened to a client with that quiet attentiveness that made people feel seen. She wasn't practicing law. She was doing something harder. Healing people through belief, through dignity, through presence. It was something most lawyers forgot how to do, something he himself had once lost. And now he saw it again. Not in a courtroom, but in this small room with soft light and mismatched chairs. "You ever think you'd be doing this?" he asked when they took a break. Kendra smiled softly. "Not in a million years." "Do you miss court?" she considered. "No. Courtrooms where I lost my voice. This place. This is where I get to give it back to others." In the break room, Bella and Ken were drawing on a whiteboard, their official logo ideas as they called them. One drawing showed a woman holding a scale in one hand and a child's hand in the other. Another had a superhero cape over a courtroom gavel. "We should put this on the sign outside," Ken said proudly. "Only if you spell justice right this time," Bella teased. Dylan watched them through the glass. Two kids who had seen too much too early now laughing like they never had. He looked at Kendra. "You know this whole thing started with a drawing." She nodded. "And a man who believed in it." Weeks passed. The foundation's name began to spread not because of marketing, but because of stories. Whispers. Women leaving toxic jobs found legal advice and protection here. Workers wrongfully fired found guidance. Immigrant mothers misled by broken contracts found someone who would listen, really listen. Not every case ended in victory, but every client left with something most never expected to find, in a legal setting, respect. One rainy evening, as Dylan locked the door, he found a letter slipped under the entrance. No return address. Just 2 words on the envelope. "Thank you." Inside, a handwritten note. "I almost gave up. I almost signed that paper. Then I saw her on the news. I saw you in court. I realized I wasn't crazy. Or alone. I came here. And now, I'm standing again." B. Dylan folded the note carefully and slid it into a small leather folder he kept locked in his desk. A folder filled with notes like that, stories like that, evidence of something working. On the foundation's first anniversary, they held a small community gathering in the park. No stage, no speeches, just blankets, lemonade, and shared laughter. At sunset, Ken pulled Kendra aside. "I brought something." He handed her a new drawing. Crayon again. But this time, no anger. No shadows. It showed a building with warm yellow light in the windows. On the door, in red crayon, "Justice lives here." Kendra bent down and hugged him tightly. "I think we found our logo," she whispered. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Dylan stood on the rooftop of the foundation, looking over the quiet street. Kendra joined him, arms crossed against the wind. They didn't speak for a while. Then she said, "I used to think surviving was the best I could hope for." And now she turned to him. "Now I know healing is different than surviving. It's quieter, but deeper, like learning to trust the air again." Dylan looked at her. "You ever think we'd end up here?" She smiled. "No, but I'm glad we did." Below them, the sign glowed softly under a street lamp. The Clara Foundation, Justice, Dignity, Voice. And for once, the world felt a little more balanced, a little more fair, a little more human. Where are you watching from? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, inspired you, or simply made you pause for a moment, consider subscribing to our channel for more stories that speak to the heart. Thank you for spending your time with us. Your presence here truly means more than you know.